Virtual Storytime here, Auntie Natasha with Virtual Storytime on the road. And we have the Hollow Tree Inn, an extract, 3 friends go into business. One rainy day, when the coon and the possum and the black crow were rummaging about their house in the big hollow tree where they all lived together, they found that above each of their rooms there was a good deal of other room that nobody ever used. Pretty soon Mr. Possum said that they shouldn't let all that good room go to waste. And Mr. Coon agreed that their house was big enough for a hotel. Of course, he didn't think that he was saying anything at the time, but it set Mr. Crow to thinking. Walking up and down, whistling, and pretty soon he stopped and looked at the coon and possum. "I'll do the cooking," he said. "Oh, if you'll get the things to cook." Right then, they made up their minds to do it. And early the next morning, while the big black crow was hurrying about inside, getting things ready for business, the coon and the possum nailed a sign outside. And this is what it read: "The Hollow Tree Inn, board by day or week." Then they went inside to help Mr. Crow get ready. And by, they all sat down and waited for people to come. Mr. Coon and Mr. Possum felt pretty well too, for they thought they would have the easiest time. You see, they had always depended on Mr. Crow a good deal, for besides being a good cook, he was a great hand to provide and knew more about where to get the best things and the best time of day or night to get them than both of them put together. So he didn't say anything, but dressed up nice and spruce and in a clean apron and a cooking cap, leaned out the window as cooks always do, with his arms folded. By and by, along came Mr. Jack Rabbit. "Hello," he said. "What's this?" Then he read the sign over and looked at Mr. Crow and asked him if it was a joke. And Mr. Crow said, "Quaw, not much. Come up and see." So then Mr. Rabbit went upstairs, and Mr. Coon and Mr. Possum showed him through. And Jack Rabbit said he didn't feel well this summer anyway, and he believed he'd just shut up his house and come on board for a little change. He said he guessed he'd take a room above Mr. Coon because it had a nice south window and a tall looking glass, and he'd pack up a few things that he needed and come over right away. Then he went home, and the coon and the possum and the old black crow all shook hands and danced around in a circle to think how well they were doing. For if Mr. Jack Rabbit came, they were sure of having as many others as their house could hold. And while they were dancing, along came Mr. Robin. He read the sign too and laughed, and then knocked on the door till Mr. Coon came down and let him in. He thought it was a joke at first too, like the rabbit, but when he heard that the Jack Rabbit was coming to board, he spoke up just as quick as anything and said that he'd come too, and he'd have his things here before supper time. He took the room over Mr. Crow because he said that he didn't mind the smell of cooking, and then maybe he'd learn some new recipes. You see, Mr. Crow and Mr. Robin are sort of kinfolk. Well, Mr. Robin hadn't more gotten out of the house when who should walk in But Mr. Squirrel, "What's all this about boarders?" said Mr. Squirrel. "I'm looking for a place to spend a month or two by myself." So then they showed him the room above Mr. Possum's, and he was so pleased with the view and everything that he paid a week's board in advance to be sure of keeping anybody else from getting it. When he was done, Coon and Possum and the old black crow did another dance and kept saying over and over how rich they'd be and what they would do with all the money. Then they heard somebody laughing outside, and when they looked out, there was Mr. Turtle, laughing and reading the sign. "Hello," he said. "This isn't the 1st of April." "Caw!" "No," said Mr. Crow. "It's a boarding house, and a good one. All the best people in the country stop here. Mr. Rabbit, Mr. Robin, and Mr. Squirrel. Sorry, Mr. Turtle, but our rooms are all full." Then Mr. Turtle did look cheap, for he thought he couldn't be in the crowd, and it was the very crowd he'd like to associate with. Just then Mr. Coon happened to think that they might fill up the room below the other big room where they all gathered to eat and talk. And Mr. Turtle said that it would suit him exactly, because he was large and heavy and didn't care much about climbing anyway. So he hurried off after to get his things too. He wasn't out of sight before here comes Mr. Dog. Mr. Coon and Mr. Possum were both looking out the window when he came up, and they jumped back like lightning. You see, they didn't like Mr. Dog. Then Mr. Crow came and looked out the window and talked to him. Mr. Dog was just as polite as a basket of chips, but of course, that was the politest thing in the world. "I've just seen Mr. Robin," said Mr. Dog, "and I came to get a room or two." "Caw! Awfully sorry, Mr. Dog, but our rooms are all full," said Mr. Crow. "Well, why don't you take down your sign then?" said Mr. Dog. "Caw! Hotels never take down their signs," said Mr. Crow. Hotels are never too full for one more either," said Mr. Dog. And there we have The Hollow Tree Inn, an extract. 3 Friends Go Into Business by Albert Bigelow Payne. And that was read to you by myself, Auntie Natasha, out here, FRCC Storytime on the road.